Hi, I'm Kayce Stephan, and today I'm presenting my research titled The Sound of Kindness, a Self-Compassion Audio Study. So to really get into the basis of what this research is about, it's looking at self-compassion and kind of defining what that is. So self-compassion is a concept that was created by Dr. Kristen Neff in response to self-esteem research that was kind of going on at the time. And so self-compassion refers to how we respond to ourselves during difficult experiences. You can also look at it as a process that emphasizes meeting oneself with kindness and compassion when we experience moments that we perceive to be those moments of failure or inadequacy. So self-compassion, it involves three kind of key components, really. Self-kindness, which is really kind of what's in the name, is it's being kind to oneself rather than being self-critical. So, for instance, saying, I'm not smart, or I should have known better. Those moments where we meet ourselves with criticism. The next component would be common humanity, which is recognizing that suffering is a part of a shared human experience. So I guess phrases you could think about with common humanity would be, I'm not alone in this, or other people have experienced the same feeling as me. So it's kind of sharing that feeling that maybe we've all felt before as people, and not necessarily focusing necessarily on the experience, but how it's making us feel. And the last component is mindfulness, which involves acknowledging the feelings or emotions of that experience without over-identifying with them. So kind of how common humanity is wanting to focus on that shared feeling, mindfulness is wanting to acknowledge those feelings and emotions. And so over-identification can be not the best thing, because it's where you're putting that label on yourself, like, I am a failure, rather than that passing feeling of, I felt like I failed this time, or I feel anxious about something. And so if you look at kind of the two little graphs here, really, you have on one side the three components of self-compassion, and on the right you have kind of what is the opposite of those components. So self-kindness, self-judgment, common humanity, isolation, and mindfulness and over-identification. So why does self-compassion research matter? Why does self-compassion matter? Self-compassion is important because it's been linked to a range of positive psychological outcomes, and research has shown that it can reduce anxiety, depression, and self-criticism, while also improving emotional regulation, which also is associated with positive psychological outcomes, and also it improves overall well-being. So there have been many positive effects associated with self-compassion on well-being in both clinical and non-clinical populations. So it's something that could be helpful for really everyone, realistically. So because of these benefits, self-compassion has become increasingly integrated into therapeutic approaches, particularly with compassion-based and mindfulness-based therapies. So to kind of frame the problem when looking at deciding what to research in my dissertation, so looking at self-compassion, when you look at the existing interventions such as compassion-focused therapy and mindful self-compassion, they've just demonstrated effectiveness in increasing self-compassion and improving psychological well-being. And while those are positive attributes of those therapies, these interventions often require substantial time commitment, financial resources, and professional guidance that realistically can create barriers to accessibility, and particularly for individuals who may not have access to therapy or structured programs, or who may have a hard time getting to those programs, or being able to afford them as well. So as a result, there has been increasing interest in more accessible alternatives that include digital and audio-based interventions. So going from our last slide there, that's where we kind of address the gap that we're looking at in this study, which is that there's limited research on brief self-compassion audio interventions. There's a multitude of interventions on long-term programs, like compassion-focused therapies and things, and mindfulness-type therapies as well. But there's not a lot of research when it comes to looking at, effects of any brief self-compassion interventions. In this case, specifically audio interventions. And so that kind of leads to the aim of this present study, which is, does a short guided self-compassion audio intervention improve self-compassion? And so it was hypothesized that participants will show a significant increase in self-compassion scores following the intervention. So we have our method. So this study used a 2x2 mixed experimental design. The condition was a between subjects variable with participants randomly allocated to either a self-compassion audio condition or a silence control condition. Time was a within subject variable, and so with state self-compassion measured before and after the audio intervention or the silence control. And then our dependent variable was state self-compassion. And as you can see in this kind of table here, that's essentially how we really looked at scores, and we're trying to read them. Procedure. So we had a complete total of 137 participants, but once we excluded those who hadn't completely filled out the survey completely, or who maybe didn't finish it, we ended up having a total of 85 participants that were included in our final analysis. So participants first go through the study information and the consent form, where they are told that they could withdraw from the study before they submitted their answers. But once those answers were submitted, there was no way to remove the data, as we did not take any identifiable information from those participants, so we wouldn't be able to figure out which person was related to which participant number. They then completed a small demographics form where they were asked to fill in their age to make sure that all of our participants were over 18. Participants first completed a baseline measure of state self-compassion, so starting with that pretest. They were then randomly assigned to either listen to the 5-minute self-compassion audio, or they were in the silent condition where they would sit in silence for the same duration as the audio. So immediately after, they completed the same state self-compassion measure again, so our post-test. And so the use of a pre-test and post-test design was to kind of allow changes in self-compassion to be measured directly, while the random allocation helped strengthen the internal validity. And then our measure that we used. So we used the state self-compassion scale, and that was created by Dr. Kristen Neff. And this is an 18-item self-report measure that assesses overall state self-compassion, as well as 6 sub-components. And that includes mindfulness, self-kindness, common humanity, isolation, over-identification, and self-judgment. Right, and then the results. So the results that we got from our data showed that there was no statistically significant effect of the intervention on overall self-compassion scores. So what we hypothesized did not happen. However, a significant interaction effect was found for the mindfulness subscale. So through this, participants in the audio intervention condition demonstrated greater increases in mindfulness compared to those in the silent control condition. And this was really what we would say is the key finding of the study, because it suggests that some components of self-compassion may be more responsive to brief interventions than others. And to kind of add on to that slightly, we did also find that there was a significant main effect of time in mindfulness scores, because overall mindfulness increased statistically significant in both conditions. And as you see here, the figure pictured in the slideshow shows the changes in mindfulness pre and post intervention in both of those groups. And as you can see, the audio group definitely increased more so than the control group. So the kind of interpretation of these results. So one possible explanation for the fact that mindfulness was the only one to increase significantly amongst both groups is that mindfulness may be more immediately responsive to brief interventions. So mindfulness involves present moment awareness, and that can be enhanced relatively through guided exercises. So it's a bit easier, in a sense, to engage with because it's just kind of being present and aware in that moment of what's going on for you. So, in contrast, the other components of self compassion, which are self kindness and common humanity, those may require longer or more sustained practice to develop. And this kind of makes sense due to the fact that those two components may have a more cognitive role, in the sense that it might take a bit more cognitive restructuring to kind of develop into those for them to increase significantly. And so this suggests that mindfulness may act as a gateway to broader self compassion. So, the kind of evaluation of our study, there were several strengths to the study. We had an experimental design, and the random allocation strengthened our internal validity, and it allowed causal relationships to be explored more effectively than correlational designs. Additionally, the intervention itself was brief and it was successful, and it's quite easy to replicate, which increases the practical applicability of the study. Though there are a few limitations to also consider as well. So, because the study was conducted online, participant engagement and environmental distractions aren't under our control. And then also the intervention, because it was extremely brief, it may have limited the extent of psychological change observed. So the implications of this research, of what we found within our results, is that there are several kind of implications that we can look at here. So brief audio-based interventions could potentially serve as low-cost and accessible well-being tools, particularly for individuals who may not have access to longer therapeutic programs, whether that's through just, in the sense, distance, the practical, I guess, considerations to actually get to those spaces, but also the financial components as well to those things. The next implication could be that, even though the intervention did not significantly increase the overall scores of self-compassion, the increase in mindfulness suggests that brief interventions may still play a useful role in initiating emotional awareness and self-reflective processes. Future research, it would be good to explore kind of longer interventions in the sense, so longer periods of studying with this kind of model. So rather than having it be a one-off brief audio session, which is what I did in my study, kind of continually over maybe a few weeks, look at the audio and maybe see if there's longer, or I guess more long-term implications to the audio, and maybe there's something that there we weren't able to find because of the brief time of our study. Future research could also look into the repeated exposure of self-compassion audio over time, kind of alongside what I've just said there. But if having those long time exposure helps increase not just mindfulness but also common humanity and self-kindness. And future research could use clinical populations to better understand how self-compassion can develop through digital formats. So, kind of to conclude everything that we found in this research, the study explored whether a brief self-compassion audio intervention could increase self-compassion, and while the intervention didn't significantly increase self-compassion, it did significantly improve mindfulness. And so from that, these findings suggest that brief audio interventions may not be sufficient to create immediate, broader self-compassion changes, but that they could act as a accessible starting point for developing self-compassion over time. And so overall, this research contributes to the kind of ever-growing field, one of research, but also to the growing field of accessible digital mental health interventions. And these are just some of the references I've used. These are mainly so towards my presentation, but you can pause here and take a look at them if you would like. Right, and that is my presentation on self-compassion. Thank you for listening.